What is up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and I am back from an unexpected break from making videos, but my return couldn't come at a better time because I have had October 8th circled on my metaphorical calendar, because nobody actually keeps calendars anymore, for a while now. And that is because I am a big horror fan, especially video games, and we got a big one that got released on October 8th, and of course I'm referring to the Silent Hill 2 remake. And of course, as I'm making this video and I'm back from my unexpected break, I've played the game and I want to talk about it. So without further ado, let's rock. The Silent Hill 2 remake was released on PS5 and PC on October 8th. If you pre-ordered the deluxe edition, you did get it 2 days early. I, however, just played the regular edition on October 8th on my PS5, and say what you will about console exclusives, the Silent Hill 2 remake was definitely optimized for the PS5. There was no loading screens, and they used the PS5 controller really well, but we'll get to that later. This game was published by Konami and developed by the Bloober team, which does have experience with horror games. It developed the Layers of Fear games alongside the Blair Witch game from a few years ago. They did have some help from the leads of the original game, so that was kind of cool. Speaking of the original game, I, despite being a big horror fan, never actually played the original 2001 Silent Hill 2, which may come as a surprise to some because I literally just said I was a big horror fan and I never played one of the most famous horror video games of all time. But I've mentioned this on past videos and also on my podcast, The Nerd You're Looking For. I rented the first Resident Evil game when I was a kid, when it first came out, played it for several hours, and I just could not handle the tank controls. So I gave up on it and I kind of set it to the side. I returned it, and I didn't really return to the franchise until years later. And so when Silent Hill franchise started to come out, I just kind of chalked it up to another Resident Evil, and I was like, well, I didn't really like the Resident Evil games, so I'm probably not going to like this game either. And now that I've played the Resident Evil games, and now I've played the Silent Hill 2 remake, I want to slap the shit out of the younger Patty for not giving those games more of a shot back then. And I was really excited for this game going into it because, yes, these remakes are kind of just an excuse for publishers to make more money on our nostalgia for the original, but it's also a chance for losers like myself to get a second chance on a great game that we missed the first time around. And I had heard such great things about this game that I was really excited for it. A guy I work with makes references to Pyramid Head a lot and gets sad when I remind him that I haven't played these games before. He's going to be very excited when I tell him that I've played this game now. The game's story is also talked about as one of video games' best of all time, so I was very psyched, and I had high expectations going into it. Since I just mentioned the story, let's go ahead and start this review by discussing the remake story. Obviously, I personally cannot speak to how it's different from the original game, but I have done a little bit of research, and from what I've gathered, it does feel like Silent Hill 2 is a self-contained story, so you don't actually have to play the first Silent Hill game, which is good because I hadn't. And the developers have also spoken to how they really wanted to stay as close as possible to the original game's story. And if that is the case, again, I can't speak to it personally because I never played the original game, but if that is the case, that they stuck to a faithful adaptation, then I totally get why it's talked about as one of the greatest video game stories of all time. This game's story hit me hard. I won't go into specifics because I normally am pretty sensitive about spoilers. I know anybody watching out there may or may not have played this game already, and different people have different definitions of what a spoiler is. So I usually try to dance around spoilers pretty often, but especially with a game like this. If you're like me and you haven't played the original, I will say the little you know going into, the better. You do play as James Sutherland, who travels to the title town of Silent Hill after he gets a letter from his late wife, but considering the info and the handwriting seem to match, he decides to check it out. And it gets really weird pretty quick. This game's story does focus a lot on trauma and how that can affect you, and that just really hit me like a brick. I especially related to the guy who was bullied. I'm a nerd in my 30s before it was cool to be a nerd, so I had my fair share of bullying, especially in middle school. Obviously, I don't agree with how he handled it in the game. Maybe just get therapy or do what I did and mask it with a weird sense of humor. But this game's story really connected with me on a personal level. I also think that the use of motion capture helped the remake a lot as well. Again, I haven't played the original game myself, but I have now gone back and kind of looked at some cutscenes from the original game, and the voice acting did feel a little bit rough to me, especially compared now that I've played this game. And I think a lot of that has to do with the motion capture is really good in this game and is a huge improvement from the first game. Of course, that has a lot to do with just the better tech and hardware, but I think the voice acting and the motion capture is really spot on in this remake. I do think the game overall looks pretty amazing. It's not the greatest game I've ever played as far as fidelity is concerned, and I always kind of feel weird describing this gross survival horror games as beautiful, but the game looks beautiful in its kind of its own creepy way. There's this intense fog throughout the town that looks great. There's a shit ton of detail in the environment. It felt very much like a game like The Last of Us Part 2, where you're exploring Seattle in that game. There's so many different types of buildings and stores that you can explore that all feel unique. I do want to mention, from what I've heard, the remake is much longer than the original. I actually think it's about double the length of the original game, and a lot of that has to do with the amount of exploring you can do in this game versus the original game. Some of the major locations are completely changed as far as the layout, and some of them are expanded as well. I know I've already said this probably 10 times by now, but I haven't played the original, but I would love to hear from those that have in the comments down below. Did the changes keep you on your toes? However, you do spend most of your time in a hotel, in the hospital, and eventually a prison. So you never really get tired of the setting because you're always kind of jumping from one location to the next. Even if you do get tired of the environment, there are sections where James goes into what they call the other world, which is an even creepier version of the area you were just in. If you've ever watched Stranger Things, kind of think of it as the upside down. It's very similar concept. It reminded me of a haunted house. The buildings were already run down as it is in the actual world, but in the other world, it kind of takes it to a whole new level. Everything's rusted, there's barbed wire on the doors, the paint on the walls are peeling. It kind of felt like I needed to get tested for tetanus just playing this game. It looked so gross. The game also uses darkness very well, as you'd expect from an atmospheric horror game. James does have a flashlight, but it sucks big time. It always seems to go out at the worst time. There's literally even a room in the prison that feels completely pitch black. I'm definitely not afraid of the dark by any means, but Silent Hill 2, the remake, did test me at times. Therefore, I do think the game is pretty scary, which I do play a lot of horror games and I watch a ton of horror films, so I don't scare easy. So the fact that I'm telling you that this game is pretty scary is a huge compliment. Obviously, that has a lot to do with the environment and monster design. Pyramid Head is a horror icon, at least in video games, for a reason. He's awesome. He looks awesome in this game, but the sound design is great as well. They use the DualSense controller really well. So you do get this radio at the very beginning of the game, and anytime a monster is close to you, it will have a white noise that goes through the controller. And I kind of went back and forth about this mechanic, because at first I thought it was really creepy and I thought it was a cool use of the DualSense controller. But then I thought, well, now I know anytime there's a white noise, a monster's nearby, and it kind of undercuts the tension. But by the late game, I was back to thinking it was creepy, because there are so many different kinds of monsters in this game, and they hid them pretty well. Some will be crawling on the floor, some will be hanging from the ceiling, and just because I knew that they were close by, judging by the white noise, didn't mean I knew where they were exactly. And I watch a lot of horror films, And a lot of the times, it's not the monster that's scary. It's the anticipation of the monster that is scary. So the white noise would kind of, okay, get me on my edge of my seat, but then I was looking around and I couldn't find them, and that process would freak me out. So I'd actually think it helps the game a little bit to have that white noise, because it does creep you out, or at least it creeped me out. I do have to mention that despite the intense fog, the stretches where James is kind of just exploring Silent Hill in the open outside did feel a little bit safer, just because there was more room to navigate. Having to fight two enemies in close quarters in these different buildings, like the hotel and the hospital and then eventually the prison, was way harder and more stressful than fighting 4 or 5 when I had space to move outside. Speaking of fighting, let's kind of move on to the gameplay, and I will start with the combat. There are 2 types of combat in the Silent Hill 2 remake. You have melee combat early on. You get this wooden board with nails at the end. You do find a metal pipe that replaces the wooden board eventually. So you have strictly only melee combat for the first part of the game. You do eventually find guns, starting off with a simple handgun, then eventually you find a shotgun, and finally a rifle towards the end of the game. Side note, I was a little annoyed by how early you find ammo for your guns before you actually get the gun in question. It felt like it was teasing me. I got shotgun ammo so early in this game, and then I was like, okay, where do I get the shotgun? Now, this is a survival horror game at its core, so the ammo is limited, so you're going to have to lean into the melee to save your ammo. And if I'm being honest, at first I was pretty bored with the melee combat. It kind of felt like a dance, and once you kind of get the rhythm of that dance, you swing, swing, dodge, and kind of rinse and repeat. Once you kind of get the rhythm of that, it does get pretty boring. But luckily, the further you get in this game, the more enemies you encounter and the different move sets that those enemies will have. And it does seem the further you get in the game, the more they'll kind of mix up some of their move sets. Now, there are some enemies that I was just like, oh, I feel way safer fighting you versus a different enemy, just because they never switched up their move set. But there were some that did kind of seem to switch it up a little bit. I do want to point out that the melee combat does feel really intense. I felt like a badass bashing these monsters in with that pipe. It kind of felt like, and I know that this is the second time I've mentioned this game, but they are some of my favorite games of all time. But the melee felt very similar to The Last of Us, except for your melee weapons don't break in Silent Hill 2. I also enjoyed the gunplay as well. The gunfire and reload animations were satisfying. I never got tired of James kind of cocking the handgun after he reloaded. I thought that was really satisfying. I also really appreciated that the crosshairs sway as you aim with James. He isn't a gun expert by any means, so the fact that he kind of can't keep anything steady while he's aiming, I thought was a really cool detail. Little stuff like that, since I play so many video games, really is the stuff that I pay a whole lot of attention to, because I think that it's the little details like that that separate good games from great games. And spoiler alert for my final star rating at the end of this video, but I do think that this is a great game. And like I said earlier, the ammo is limited, so I did find myself kind of mixing the melee with the gunfire. Most of the time I would try to use my melee, especially if the monster was by itself. There were these monsters that kind of looked like nurses to me with knives that were kind of just shoot on sight. I did not want to bother with them at all. I don't know what it was about them, but they always gave me trouble. And then of course, if they hit you because they had the knives, it did a lot of damage. So I would literally just shoot them as soon as I saw them. I also seem to struggle with multiple enemies at once. Some of that is just me being shit at this game, but some of that is the game would actually swing at the wrong monster. So literally, anytime that you hit the swing mechanic, the melee swing, it would swing at the monster that was closest to you. And that sounds all fine and good. However, when you would kill a monster, they would lay on the ground and you can actually stomp on them on the ground. And so literally, if there's more than one monster and you would kill one of them, it would be laying on the ground. If you're fighting another one that's close by the one that's laying on the ground, sometimes instead of swinging at the monster that's still alive and you're fighting against, it would actually just swing at the one on the ground. And then I would literally get hit because the AI would swing at the wrong monster. So most of the time, if there were a big group of monsters, I would kind of try to thin them out with my handgun and take out the last one or two with my melee weapon to save some ammo. I do also want to note, and this is mostly me being an idiot hitting the wrong button, but the quick turnaround is right next to the melee swing button. And so there were several times while playing this game that I would just turn around instead of swinging my weapon. And I did take a few hits just because I hit the wrong button. And of course, as you would expect, if you do take hits, your health does go down. Silent Hill 2 Remake does not have a traditional health bar. It's very similar to the recent Resident Evil remakes, and it's much more of a visual health bar. It's a third-person game, so the more hurt James gets, the slower he gets. He starts to limp. He doesn't run around as fast. He kind of grunts as he moves. Your screen also gets a little blurry, and there's kind of this faded blood outline that gets more and more prominent the more injured James gets, which of course is not reinventing the wheel. However, I do want to give them credit because I really appreciated that they went with this route versus a traditional health bar, just because the less it's on my screen, the more immersive and cinematic it feels like. And this game is definitely an atmospheric horror game that wants you to really get immersed into it. So to have that constant reminder of having that health bar right there on the screen would get very distracting. You also have two health items. You have a drink and you have a syringe. The drink only heals a little bit of health while the syringe completely heals you. And much like the ammo, the health items are very scarce, so I did find myself kind of saving them until I was on my last leg. Speaking of that, I do want to also mention that the healing animation is a little too long for my taste. I did die at least a couple of times because I waited too long to heal, and then I kind of had to do it at the last minute in the middle of a fight, and it was just too slow, and I eventually died, which is pretty annoying. But again, that's also kind of on me for waiting until the last second to do it. So eventually I did get kind of just used to that, and I would eventually just pull the trigger a little bit earlier to avoid this happening. Using the health items is also very easy. You either just tap the triangle for the drink or hold it for the syringe. And I want to give this game credit as a whole. Everything seems pretty streamlined. The map is easy to navigate in and out of. You'll come across notes, letters, and even medical charts, among other things. And James will actually write things down on his map. He'll kind of make notes to himself if there's something you need to remember for later. It definitely helps with safe combos and puzzle solutions. When you interact with something like a locked door, the game will automatically just use the key that you need. The guns are mapped automatically to your D-pad. The rare times you need to actually combine items together, the process is pretty straightforward. So all in all, I think I spent maybe less than 30 minutes the entire time I played this game navigating an inventory menu, which definitely helped with the immersion, which again, going back to what I was just talking about, this is a atmospheric horror game. The immersion is important. And the fact that this game really kind of went out of its way to not have you spend so much time in menus, I think is great. And while I do appreciate how the game streamlines the gameplay, which means I spend more time actually playing the game overall, as far as the difficulty is concerned, did feel a little easy for my taste. Once you kind of get the handle of the give and take of the melee combat and you watch to not get overwhelmed by multiple enemies, and you also aren't a dummy like me and press the wrong button, you should be fine with this game. I did play this game on the default difficulty, so there's the normal difficulty. It does have this interesting feature where you can change the difficulty for not only the combat, but also the puzzles. I did really enjoy the puzzles in this game. It felt very much like the Resident Evil remakes, where you do have to kind of suspend your belief about why these puzzles are in these buildings to begin with, but you are also playing a game where you're fighting all of these crazy monsters. So suspending your belief really shouldn't be that hard in a game like this. but I actually enjoyed these puzzles more than the ones in the Resident Evil remakes, which is a huge compliment because I absolutely love those games. In those games, you're kind of just collecting the items to put into the lock, and that's pretty much it. But in this game, you still have to solve a puzzle. There's literally a puzzle early on in the game where you have to get these coins and you have to place them in order based on the riddle in the machine. And I thought that was really cool. It's not terribly difficult. It's pretty easy to figure out the solution, but the fact that you just collecting the coins and then solving a puzzle, I thought was really cool. I am interested in playing it in the harder difficulty. Like I said, I didn't find this game terribly difficult. There are multiple endings, so that makes playing this game and replaying this game a lot more interesting to me. I'm not sure I'll jump straight back into it. I'm kind of slowly making my way through the new Zelda game, so obviously I want to play that next. And also this game is pretty intense, even though it isn't super difficult, it is still an intense experience, and I'm not entirely sure I want to immediately do that again. So wrapping up, I did really enjoy this game. It certainly doesn't hurt that it was released in October. I'm a big Halloween fan. I love watching a bunch of horror films during this time of year, and it was really cool to have this great horror video game to play as well. While it wasn't crazy difficult on the default difficulty, the monster design was awesome, even if some of the melee combat was a bit clunky at times. The detail in the environments was top notch. I love that this game gave me space to explore, and the story just knocked me on my ass. It was so awesome. And while I still think I prefer the Resident Evil 2 remake to this game, I loved how the Silent Hill 2 remake leaned into more of the psychological horror than the campy horror you get from the Resident Evil games. So overall, I'm going to give it 4 stars. And to be honest with you, this is in contention for my game of the year. I liked Hades 2, but that's in early access, so I don't know if I'm going to give that my game of the year, just because I don't like to give things in early access game of the year. I also really enjoyed Black Myth, but overall, I'm a sucker for a great horror game, and this is easily the best horror game we've gotten this year. And I also didn't play the original, so this is a brand new game for me. But as always, those are just my thoughts on the Silent Hill 2 remake. I'd love to hear yours in the comments down below, especially if you've played the original and maybe you've played this game. Let me know how the changes were for you. Did they keep you on your toes? Did you think that it was too faithful or not faithful enough? Let me know in the comments down below. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, which you probably did since you've made it this far in the video, smash that like button, as the kids say. It's just a quick and easy way to tell YouTube that you enjoyed this video, and they should push it to other people that might enjoy it as well. And if you did enjoy it, definitely consider subscribing. And if you do subscribe, ding that bell. That way you get notified every time I post another video. I try to post weekly gaming related content. I haven't been great with the weekly thing lately, but I will try to post weekly gaming related content. If you like that content, again, pretty sure you do because you've made it this far, definitely consider subscribing and dinging that bell. But until next video, take it easy. What's up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and this is my boy Yoshi, aka Kitty Boy, and we were just talking, and we agree that since you made it this far in the video, you might as well subscribe. You wouldn't want to disappoint Kitty Boy, would you?